Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As the clock turned to 7 o'clock, you probably received an email from Google Classroom telling you that you have something late. You don't, you're here right now. A reminder that completing the survey at the end of the webinar today, for which you will have a link, counts as your participation and your grade for this. So you can just fully disregard that email or that message that you got from Google Classroom. We are recording this, and Lynn has captioning turned on, which you can easily turn off if you find that distracting or not helpful. And I am just going to move to the next slide here. Whoops. Okay. So I am really excited to welcome Dr. Abby Chandler tonight, who will be our speaker for webinar 2 of Rev Ideals. This is the first time that Dr. Chandler and I are meeting. But I know that you took part in the in-person Rev Ideals seminar last year. This is before my time, so I'm not up on all of the details. So we have a real Rev Ideals expert with us tonight, and we're really happy to have you here. A reminder that if you have any questions at all as the proceedings are underway tonight, to use that Q&A box. That could be because you need something clarified, you have a question, though we will be addressing questions at the end of the webinar tonight. But we are personing it if you have any questions at all. Okay. As I said, the survey at the end of the webinar tonight is required for attendance credit. Tomorrow morning, we'll post the slides from tonight, the recording, and everything will be available. If we happen to talk about anything, there are additional resources that become important, we will share all of those materials tomorrow morning under webinar 2 materials. One more thing that I will point out is that following webinar 1, I started creating an ongoing list that's a Google Doc that each of our esteemed speakers adds to. So we have this growing and ever-growing wonderful list of different resources that you can explore. And that's always available on Google Classroom. And you'll see that I'll make updates to that beginning tomorrow morning. Then Module 3, all of the materials, the reading materials, the new primary source set, the new discussion, that will all be available for you on the morning of Friday, February 16th, which is this Friday. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and hand it over to you, Dr. Chandler.
All right, and I will start sharing my screen. All right, can everybody see that? All right, so I'm going to be talking about revolutionary ideals and North Carolina's Regulator Rebellion. And the Regulator Rebellion is a lesser known rebellion from North Carolina that took place in the eve of the American Revolution. And because it's a lesser known rebellion in American history, I'm going to start out with talking about the causes of the Regulator Rebellion. And then I'll tell you more about what happened during the Regulator Rebellion. So North Carolina was in a very challenging position during the colonial period. They have relatively little industry. It's a very rural colony. They don't have any deep harbors, which makes it challenging to get materials to market. And as a result, North Carolina is much poorer than its neighbors in Virginia and South Carolina. And this means that North Carolina can only afford to pay salaries to the governor, to the justices, and to the members of the legislature. And this doesn't cover all of the government officials in the colony. And where this really starts to become an issue is that officials at the county level, sheriffs and clerks, are not paid salaries, but instead they're allowed to collect an additional percentage of the taxes and the fees they collect. And this has to be paid in coin rather than the barter systems commonly used by British colonists. And the problem of having to pay things in coin is a problem across all of the colonies, but it's a particularly big issue in North Carolina because it's such a relatively poor colony. And the real problem with those percentages is they're unregulated. There is no rule that says the sheriff can collect only 2% of the taxes that he is collecting. So a sheriff could collect up to 8% of the taxes, and this is on top of the taxes. And they're also undocumented. So you could have the sheriff show up at your farm and you could pay your taxes and pay his additional percentage, and he could come back 2 weeks later and say, oh, you didn't pay your taxes. And you would say, well, I did. And he would say, no, you didn't. And he, of course, is the person who's in charge of keeping all of the records. So this is a problem that exists in the 1720s and 1730s and the 1740s. It starts to get out of hand in the middle of the 18th century because North Carolina, like all of the British North American colonies, is rapidly expanding in the mid 18th century. And I'm going to go forward a slide to a map. I will then go back to that one. And if you look at the western or towards the western edge of this map, Orange County, Rowan County, Anson County, in the 1750s and 1760s, this was Western North Carolina. And colonists began establishing farms there in the 1750s, but by the 1760s, you have the formal creation of Orange, Rowan, and Anson counties, which leads to a wave of county officials. They are establishing courts, they are collecting taxes, they are formally processing land sales while claiming those additional percentages. So if you were a colonist who moved out there to establish a farm in the 1750s, you've been farming that land for the last decade or so, and now there's this wave of officials who are showing up on your doorstep demanding all of this money. And the end result is this further accelerates older tensions between powerful colonists in eastern urban North Carolina and colonists living in western rural North Carolina. And this next slide has pictures of both these places. So the slide on the left is a picture I took in the town of New Bern, North Carolina, which in the 1750s and 1760s was the capital of North Carolina. So it's a very urban place, or at least urban for North Carolina. The picture on the right is of farmland in Orange County. And this just gives you a sense of where these people were coming from. And tensions between urban and rural and Eastern and Western colonists are something we see all over British North America. It's something that will also be in existence after the American Revolution. But in North Carolina, it's particularly exasperated because of that system of collecting the percentages. And so by the year 1766, colonists living have had enough. And so you have the first meeting of the Sandy Creek Association in 1766. And this is a picture of Sandy Creek in Orange County. And all of the people who organized the Sandy Creek Association, not surprisingly, have farms along Sandy Creek. So that's its name. And they publish their Regulator's advertisement #1 in August of 1766. And I find this a particularly interesting document. And this is, of course, one of the documents that I gave you to read because they are clearly concerned about issues going on in North Carolina, and they credit the Sons of Liberty. And in North Carolina, the members of the Sons of Liberty are all also members of those powerful Eastern families. This is very much of a part of politics in Eastern North Carolina. And so they say they have just now redeemed us from tyranny, which is the stamp tax. But as the regulators add, they are set in offices. They are vested with power. They would soon corrupt again and oppress if they were not called upon to give an account of their stewardship. So they're giving the Sons of Liberty credit for their response to the British Empire, but they are very concerned about the Sons of Liberty possibly corrupting and oppressing them. And this is a tension that we're going to go on seeing throughout the entire Regulator Rebellion. So in the 18th century, if you were a British subject, and by that I really mean if you were a white male British subject, and you were concerned about politics in your local community or on a broader level, you had the right to submit a petition. And the regulators submit multiple petitions in 1768 and 1769. And these are petitions going to Governor William Tryon. William Tryon is a man who received his appointment from King George III. He is a royally appointed governor, as most of the British governors are at this period. The legislature, however, are locally elected men. And so in North Carolina, as in many of the colonies, you have that tension between a royally appointed governor and a locally elected legislature. So the regulators are issuing their petitions, asking Tryon and the legislature to consider, as they say, regulating, we would say reforming, the collection of taxes and fees. They're very clear. It's not that they're opposed to paying taxes. They understand this is part of being in a society. What they're concerned about is the unregulated fees that are getting tacked on to everything else. And this sets up this firestorm in which the regulators are petitioning Governor Tryon, asking him to intervene on their behalf, and they're petitioning the legislature. Tryon is at least initially willing to consider the regulators' concerns. The legislature, by contrast, has absolutely no interest in making these changes because the legislature created these laws, and the men who have all those county positions, the county clerks, the county sheriffs, are the younger sons and brothers and cousins of the legislature. So this is a system that benefits their families. And so in the eyes of the legislature, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this process. So that's one problem going on in North Carolina. There's also a pre-existing tension between Tryon and the legislature, because Tryon and the legislature fought over the Stamp Act crisis back in 1765. Tryon supported the Stamp Act. The legislature did not. Again, that's the members of the Sons of Liberty. And now the Townshend Acts are in place. These are those taxes, most famously on tea, but also on glass and lead and paint and paper. And Tryon is so concerned about his legislature debating the Townshend Acts, possibly taking action against the Townshend Acts, that he dissolves the North Carolina legislature in 1769, rather than risk a debate and the legislature deciding to take action. This has the trickle-down effect that the regulators' petitions don't get discussed because they're submitting petitions to the right legislature, but the legislature is not in session because Tryon has dissolved it. And so this adds this whole other level of complication. This next picture, by the way, is of the governor's palace in New Bern, North Carolina, again, the capital of North Carolina at that period, Tryon and his family lived in the building at the center. However, the building off to the left is where the legislature met. So that's where all these conversations are going. By 1770, the regulators are just completely and totally frustrated with the situation. They're submitting their petitions and nobody's answering, and they can't get discussed in the legislature because Tryon has dissolved the legislature. And finally, a group of frustrated regulators disrupts the Orange County Superior Court meeting in September of 1770. And as part of this attack, they also go after Orange County Clerk Edmund Fanning in his home in Hillsborough, North Carolina. Hillsborough is the county seat for Orange County. This next picture was taken in Hillsborough and has the sign marking where Edmund Fanning's home was located. And here again, we just have this impasse in which Tryon and the legislature are at an impasse with each other over the Townsend Acts, but Tryon and the legislature and the regulators are at an impasse over the regulators' concerns. And now the regulators are attacking courts, and the legislature ultimately decides that they have to take some serious action. And this is a point I want to be really clear about. It's the legislature who is pushing for cracking down on the Regulator Rebellion. It's not so much Tryon. Ultimately, Tryon will agree to support the legislature because he's not willing to do anything about the Townsend Acts, but the legislature also want Tryon to do something about the Regulator Rebellion, and Tryon is really caught between a rock and a hard place. He can do something about the regulators, or ostensibly, he could do something about the Townsend Acts. He won't do anything about the Townsend Acts, so he's going to do something about the regulators. And so this leads to the passing of what is known as Johnson's Riot Act, or the Bill for Preventing Tumultuous and Riotous Assemblies, on December 15th, 1770. And what it says is, if persons to the number of 10 or more being unlawfully, tumultuously, and riotously assembled together are commanded to disperse, and they then stay put for an hour, then such continuing together shall be adjudged felony. And committing a felony this is a picture from the original Johnson's Riot Act. Committing a felony is, as it is now, a far worse crime. In the 18th century, people who were charged and convicted of felonies could be put to death. And the Riot Act actually explicitly says that, yes, they will be imposing the death penalty. There's also a note saying that you cannot plead act of clergy, which was a policy in the 18th century that dates back into the medieval period in English law. If you could demonstrate that you were a minister, then you would be exempted from capital punishment. By the time of the 18th century, this had evolved into a system whereby the only thing you would have to do to demonstrate you were a member of the clergy was to recite a particular psalm. And incidentally, the two British soldiers who were convicted for the Boston Massacre a few years earlier in, that will happen in a couple of years. My timing is off. No, I'm sorry. Boston Massacre is 1770. Yes, that is concurrent. I was thinking of the Tea Party. That's up 1773. Anyway, yes, this is concurrent with the trials for the Boston Massacre. The two British soldiers who were convicted during the Boston Massacre trials both were able to plead clergy, which saved their lives. Here, Johnson's Riot Act explicitly states that the regulators cannot claim right of clergy if they convict them, they death. And there's one last clause in Johnson's Riot Act. It can be applied retroactively. So Governor Tryon orders trials on felony charges for the regulators who disrupted the Orange County Superior Court meeting back in September of 1770. And Tryon decides that he's going to hold these trials in Orange County, and he orders the North Carolina militia to march west to Hillsborough in the spring of 1771. So here is that map again. Tryon is based in New Bern, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. They are now going to be marching out to Hillsborough, which you can see in the top central part of this map. So the regulators are trying to decide what to do next. You increasingly have regulators gathering in Orange County. The militia is on its way. Everyone knows that they're going to eventually bump into each other. And ultimately, both sides gathered near Alamance Creek, which is, and I'll go back to that map again, that blue line running through past where it says Battle of Alamance. There's a last-minute diplomatic effort from the regulators, which just falls apart, and the two sides begin exchanging fire at the Battle of Alamance. And ultimately, Tryon and the militia will defeat the regulators. And it's pretty clear the regulators never really had a chance. They did early on in the battle manage to capture a cannon. Their problem was they have no cannonballs. So having a cannon, if you have no cannonballs, is not particularly helpful. I mean, it means that people aren't firing cannonballs at you, but it doesn't really help you defend yourself. And so the whole battle is over in 4 or 5 hours, and the remaining regulators are basically gathered up. 6 of them will eventually be hanged on treason charges on June 19th, 1771 in Hillsborough. And this picture here is of the Alamance battlefield, marking out where the different sides were taking up their positions that day. So the Regulator Rebellion is now over. I'm going to turn now to talking about what happened after the Regulator Rebellion, and also how the Regulator Rebellion fits into the marching towards the American Revolution, which, of course, it's the spring of 1771. We're well on the way for. And this is one of the things I found particularly interesting in my research. British colonists outside of North Carolina saw the defeat of the Regulator Rebellion as evidence of imperial overreach. And this is an argument that's particularly being made by people in Massachusetts. There's a man named Mr. Thompson who publishes a newspaper called the Massachusetts Spy in Boston, and he's publishing accounts of the Battle of Alamance and making the argument that this is evidence that Britain is out to get all of us. The problem with this particular presentation of the Regulator Rebellion and the Battle of Alamance, as I mentioned, is the Regulator Rebellion was opposed by the North Carolina legislature. The North Carolina legislature, many of them are members of the Sons of Liberty. Many of them had fought against the Stamp Act. They're actively opposing the Townshend Acts. And so they are working very hard at this point in time to present the regulators' concerns as a completely and totally separate issue. This has absolutely nothing to do with concerns about imperial overreach. This is a bunch of crazy backwoods farmers. We are the good guys here. The regulators should have been defeated. And as we think about revolutionary ideals, I think this particular contrast between how people outside of North Carolina see the Regulator Rebellion, it will ultimately be described as the first battle of the American Revolution, and how people within North Carolina see the Regulator Rebellion as a completely and totally separate issue is important as we think about revolutionary ideals. In many ways, the regulator's cause fits that paradigm of revolutionary ideals. They wanted a voice in the North Carolina government. They felt that the system of collecting taxes and fees was unjust and needed to be regulated. I mean, these are concerns that fit right in with the revolutionary ideals and the March to the Revolution, but the people who are advocating for these things are not the people who ultimately will advocate for the revolution. And this really becomes apparent in 1775. North Carolina will be the first British colony to expel the royal government. And one of the reasons they do that is by that point in time, Governor Tryon had gone on to be governor of New York. He had been replaced by a new royal governor named Josiah Martin. And one of the first things that Josiah Martin did when he arrived in North Carolina was to investigate the causes of the Regulator Rebellion. He went out and did a tour of the backcountry, interviewing people who'd been regulators, and he came back to New Bern and went to the legislature and said, wait, the regulators had a point. You are enforcing a deeply unjust and corrupt system. Fix this. And the legislature's response was, you're this governor coming over from England telling us what to do. This is not okay. This is imperial overreach. And so Josiah Martin is the first royal governor to be kicked out in 1775, and North Carolina will be established as a free entity. And in many of them responding to this, many of the regulators will become loyalists and support the British Empire during the American Revolution. So as we talk about what are revolutionary ideals, often the people claiming the values that we think of, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, are people on the other side, the British side. So as we continue having these conversations, this is another part of this story that I hope also becomes part of how we tell the story of the coming of the American Revolution. And thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Chandler. I did see that there were a couple of questions that came in. Perhaps we should address those now.
We can do that. Let's ask a couple
Yeah.
content questions and then we'll shift
Yeah.
over to pedagogy and then we'll answer some more at the end.
Yeah.
I'm guessing
Yeah,
there's gonna be some more coming in.
Yeah, I do think it makes sense to do a couple of follow-ups. I'll leave that to you,
Absolutely.
Lynn.
What I think is really interesting about this story is it takes the idea of patriots and loyalists and kind of flips it on its head. And we've got a couple questions about how this kind of plays out. So first question, how did the influx of the German immigrants play into the regulators movement? To what extent were they involved or did they influence what happens in North Carolina?
So just to ask a follow-up question, are you thinking of the Moravian immigrants who settle in Salem, North Carolina?
I'm going to say yes to that because it's a question and I don't have the answer from that person just yet, but let's start with that. And Terry, if you want to clarify in the Q&A box, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So this is part of why I find North Carolina so fascinating. And this dates back to the founding of Carolina Colony in the 1660s. Part of the Carolina Colony Charter, which was written by John Locke, explicitly said, if you live in Carolina Colony, we do not have the right to restrict your religious practices. As long as there are at least 7 of you, you can declare yourselves a church. You can go out there and worship as you please. And so you have communities of various religions, many of whom wind up living in the backcountry. And members of those various, largely the radical Protestant religions, many of them become involved in the Regulator Rebellion. So there are Quakers among the Regulators, there are Baptists, there are Methodists. The German Moravians are another radical Protestant group who are living near the Regulators. It's about a 30-40 minute drive today from the Alamance battlefield site to the town of Winston-Salem. They are supportive of the Regulators' concerns, but they are adamant that they do not want to get involved. And I think this was partly because, I mean, they are in an English colony as a German community. They do not want to run the risk of being kicked out. Also, the Moravians are pacifists. And as I alluded to, there is a very violent strain to the Regulators, or some of the Regulators. So that bumps up against the Moravians. So while they are quietly supportive, they are determinedly not taking sides. The one direct connection between that German Moravian community and the Regulator Rebellion, in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Alamance, Tryon and the militias are exhausted, and Tryon and the men who are immediately below him, so the officers of the militia, show up in the German Moravian community and announce that we're here for our vacation. And the Moravians are not really in a position to say no. So it's basically bed and breakfast with the Moravians, who then submit a series of documents asking to please be paid back for all the money they spent feeding and housing Tryon and the officers and some of the other members of the militia. And I traced through all of those documents in the North Carolina State Archives, which was fascinating. They did get some money paid back to them, but I think ultimately they saw this as an investment in being able to continue living in North Carolina. So I hope that answers that question.
All right. Here's another interesting one. Do you think that the attack on Fanning was personal, targeting him because he denied the first 2 requests to be heard at the local level? Or do you think was it about an attack on Fanning versus an attack on the idea?
Oh, it was an attack on Fanning.
Why did they have it out for him? Because they really did. Why is that?
Oh, the stories I can tell about the Regulators and Fanning. So part of Fanning's problem in North Carolina is he is from a New England family. He went to Yale. And so he's a bit of an outsider in North Carolina. He is a man who is very, very, very interested. He's from a good family, but a not very wealthy family. He's a man who's very interested in rising in society, and he is courting Governor Tryon, and Governor Tryon is courting him. So there's that. Also, Fanning is, I think, the best way to describe Fanning, and I am trying to remember the name of the author of this particular book, and I can look that up afterwards and send it out. But it was probably the best analysis I've ever seen of Fanning, which was to people who were his equal or his better, he was charming, he was polite. To people he saw as his inferiors, he just behaved disgracefully. He was rude, he was dismissive. And so that's a piece of it. But Fanning and the regulators just rubbed each other the wrong way. There's a regulator named Redknapp Howell, who is known as the ballad writer of the regulators. He composed song after song after song about Fanning. And finally, Herman Husband, who writes pamphlets for the regulators, has one titled A Fan for Fanning and a Touchstone for Tryon, which describes in graphic detail what he would like to see done to each of those gentlemen. So yes, this is a personal vendetta on both sides.
I can imagine some History Day students really jumping over those pamphlets to kind of integrate them into their project.
And actually, again, I can send you this material. There are two regulators who take Fanning to trial on extortion charges.
Mhm.
And the Attorney General of the entire British Empire weighs in on it. So there's a History Day paper, and I would be happy to send materials about that to anybody who's more interested.
Yeah,
Oh.
wonderful. Please share and I'll add it to the growing list.
Excellent. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna ask one more question. We've got some more in the queue that we're gonna come back to, but I'm gonna do one more, then we'll jump. We got some requests in the last module to talk a little more about pedagogy and specific strategies for making these sources more accessible. So we're gonna do a little segment on that. But let me ask this question before we jump over. The question is, did the regulators mostly become loyalists because Martin sided with them? Tryon Palace represents Martin now as a weak and ineffective government. So what essentially ends up with a lot of these regulators?
So the seeds for regulators becoming loyalists actually go a long way back. So, as I mentioned earlier, everyone agrees that the North Carolina government is corrupt and it's a problem and something has to be done about it. Arthur Dobbs, who was governor before Tryon, was talking about doing something about it against the direct wishes of the legislature. He then dies very, very suddenly, so that's out. Tryon initially does make noise about doing something. The problem is the legislature don't want him to do something about it. And by that point in time, as I mentioned, Tryon is between that rock and a hard place of legislature wants me to do something about the Townsend taxes and something about the regulators, and I can do something about the regulators, but I can't do something about Townsend taxes. The other piece, and this is one man who I didn't talk about this evening, but who is the center of my research, is the Chief Justice in North Carolina at this point in time is a man named Martin Howard, who, like all chief justices and like the royal governors, is appointed by the crown. And Martin Howard is very supportive of the regulators. And there's a fourth petition that they send him. And I get the sense that there's a lot of common ground between the regulators and Howard. There's there's Martin Howard is the Chief Justice. There's the associate justices who are both from North Carolina families. One of them is a man whose last name is Henderson. And there's a letter from another Henderson family saying, the problem with Martin Howard is he's too nice to those regulators. So there's this pattern. And then, of course, you have Josiah Martin. There's this pattern that royally appointed officials are willing to look into the regulators' concerns. Their local legislature is not. Therefore, the people coming from the British Empire look like they might be supportive of us. The local legislature definitely are not. So I think that's where that's coming from.
Excellent. All right, well, let's do this. We've got some other good questions in the queue, but let's jump and do our second segment and then we'll pop back and answer all of these. We've got some content and some really interesting questions about your research process, Dr. Shannon. They really want to know how you hit on this story. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but let's pop over. Krista, can you share a little bit about some ways that some of our teachers help to take the Regulator Rebellion and make it accessible to students and some tips you can use when you're working with this time period?
Yes, absolutely. Is this visible to everyone? Have I successfully shared my screen? Wonderful.
You're good.
Okay, so looking at some resources that NHD has about the Regulator Rebellion, and looking more broadly at the different resources that we have available as part of the Revolutionary Ideals lesson plan book, I made a list of 5 different recommendations to make colonial sources more accessible for students. And certainly these can be applied to lots of different types of sources, irrespective of place and time. So the 5 that I have identified, I'm going to go through each one briefly, but they are: don't be afraid of transcriptions or simplifications. And Adrian, thank you very much for your question in the Q&A box. And when I look at that one in just a moment, I hope to address some of the question that you have there. And Dr. Chandler, you can certainly weigh in too. The second point is to establish knowledge of notations and abbreviations, establish definitions from sources or from historians. What's really important is to scaffold the analysis process, not to take a document that is written in cursive from the 1700s and expect that students will be able to have the skills and ability to meaningfully interact with and engage with that text. And then the last tip is to think outside the text box, or to think outside the box. So in addition to looking at the whole of the Revolutionary Ideals lesson plan book, the one that I really want to highlight, where I drew some examples from, and that I encourage all of you to take a look at, is the resource, the lesson, The Regulators of North Carolina, Rebels with a Cause. So this is a really great way to take all of this contextualizing information that we've learned from Dr. Chandler today and to bring directly to your students. So interrogating and analyzing the Regulator Rebellion is something that is possible for you in your very own classroom through this lesson plan with the Rev Ideals lesson plan book. So this is just a screenshot that I shared. The link to this lesson, if you're not already familiar with it, is available in the list of resources for you all. So in order to illustrate each of these 5 points, I looked at this lesson about the Regulator Rebellion. And the first one, again, is don't be afraid of transcriptions or simplifications. One of the resources that is available in this lesson shows, I think really helpfully, shows an image of the handwritten manuscript, the Regulator's petition. This is not going to be terribly helpful for students to interact with, but it might be important. I think it is important for them to see this as a primary source. So to the extent that you're able, and to the extent that you as a teacher have access to things like transcriptions that we've provided here in this lesson, having students interact with the text as it is transcribed is a really important way to ensure their success with being able to interact with the text. Adrian, you asked in the Q&A whether or not cursive is taught in history college classrooms. To my knowledge and from my own experience as a history graduate student, I was never taught cursive, though as a child I was taught cursive, so that really wasn't a stumbling block for me. But talking with other history educators within the higher ed context, I know that folks are worried and aware that incoming students don't have the skills to be able to look at primary sources as manuscripts. But whether or not individual institutions or programs or coalitions of programs are really meaningfully addressing this, I don't know. And maybe Dr. Chandler, that's something that you can speak to after. I know that in my own teaching practice, I had a notebook that I wanted students to look at that was written as a manuscript, and I had to transcribe it myself. It was work that I enjoyed doing, and I was able to share it with my local historical society, the whole transcription that I wrote, so that other teachers and learners could benefit from that transcription. But that required a lot for me. And certainly we don't expect that each individual person who's looking to teach a cursive document is able to do something like that. But in many cases, especially with this lesson and within the Rev Ideals lesson plan book, there are transcriptions provided. The next tip is to establish knowledge of notations and abbreviations. So in this lesson, in the brackets that you see there, you'll see that there are definitions provided or other interpretations of what could be a complex phrasing that students might not initially understand. So this is built into this lesson, but it might be really helpful for you as a teacher to take a quick scan through the different texts that you're hoping students will look at and analyze, and just to make sure that there are grade appropriate and level appropriate interpretations of various phrases. So something like in mean circumstances, saying poverty is really helpful to students and to instructors who are taking a look at text or portions of text like this. The other thing here that I have noted is SIC, S-I-C in brackets, which is a way that a person transcribing notates that there's an error in the original text. So just making sure that students have a knowledge of this, that if something is in brackets, something is italicized, that often is a signal for them that they should just take a second to look at what is in front of them, that it might be some helpful tips to help them better understand the text at hand. Tip 3 is establish definitions from sources. I'm not going to address from historians here. We're just going to look at from sources. So within the lesson of the Regulator Rebellion, there's a wonderful box at the outset of the activity that asks students to really analyze the text to make sure that they understand what a grievance is and what is a redress of a grievance. So just taking 3, 5, 8 minutes within the classroom to make sure that there are good understood definitions of a really important term is a good use of time. What I've been talking about this whole time here is essentially scaffolding the analysis process, which is what this resource does. So you'll find in this lesson that of the language from the petition and to create translations of it. This handout here that's given to students, or the workshop that's given to students, models what those translations look like so that they're not left with just a full blank slate of translations to make. This can help bolster their confidence that they really do have the ability to do it if they see it modeled for them. And it's also modeled for you in terms of the different kinds of notes or tips that you can give your students and the further contextualizing information that might be really important. And I just want to shout out that this is Dr. Chandler's notes here written in blue. So thank you for helping us again and again. And the final tip I'll give is as you're creating lessons, as you're thinking about how to engage with students about colonial sources, to think outside the text box, to think outside of just texts that are written. In this particular lesson, there is one of the songs, and perhaps Dr. Chandler, this is one of the songs that you were talking about earlier, or that you referred to. Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, great. So there is a small 5-minute activity within this lesson that asks students to think about songs as text and as primary sources. But you might even want to think even further than that. And here I have a link to a really wonderful short article that Dr. Chandler wrote that was in Perspectives in History, which is the American Historical Association's news magazine, where Dr. Chandler talks about using a T-set. So how to meaningfully incorporate objects within the US survey classroom. So I'll share a PDF of this, you'll have the link to it, and then you'll have just a couple of minutes to read through about why Dr. Chandler thinks that historical objects are important for use within the classroom. And I certainly agree. Okay. So with that, I think we can move back to the list of questions that we have.
All right. We do want to be respectful of time. We know some of you have to go at the top of the hour. Just a reminder, make sure to drop in that survey, but we'll do some questions while we've got that up there before we wrap. All right. So this question came up about cursive. Dr. Chandler, how are your students reacting or handling sources in cursive today?
So this is not a direct conversation I have had with any of my students because everything they're working with is in transcriptions. But I know this is a broader issue that, yes, the history field is talking about. And the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, which is the biggest professional organization in the field of early American history, it does college training classes and studying early American history, graduate school training. They have started including classes on how to read cursive, recognizing that if we're going to have early Americanists working with colonial documents, that being able to do those transcriptions is essential. So that's one example of the history field starting to adapt to that.
Okay.
I want to add just one more thing that came to mind about that. I am aware that the Newberry Library in Chicago hosts transcribathons. I'm not exactly sure what kinds of resources they have or courses that they have, though I would not be surprised if the Newberry Library had some sort of support for learning cursive or how to read it.
The Library of Congress and the National Archives also crowdsource. There's a couple big collections that got transcribed during COVID because people had some time on their hands. All right, here's a question, Dr. Chandler, from Derek. Derek wants to know, why do you think the Sons of Liberty get all the credit within the school curriculum and the textbooks? Why do you think it's so focused on the northern colonies and the southern colonies don't get as much credit for getting the revolution going?
I think this goes back to the first generation of people who started writing histories of the American Revolution. And a lot of it is because these are predominantly people who are based in the North. And so, and more specifically, based in Massachusetts. And the first histories of the Revolution start getting written before the war is over. Mercy Otis Warren, Boston based, very famously is already working on her history of the Revolution before the war is over. And so you have that first generation in the 1780s and into the 1820s who are very consciously, very carefully writing histories of the revolution. And part of what makes our relationship with the revolution complicated is a lot of the early national sense of the revolution didn't come from so much the actual generation that fought the revolution. It came from the generation after who wrote the histories of the revolution. And so they are predominantly in the North, many of them in Massachusetts, who are highlighting the stories of people from the North. And all of this gets compounded with the Civil War because in the move towards the Civil War, there's that push to demonstrate that the northern half of the United States is the true United States. The establishment of Thanksgiving as a national holiday by Abraham Lincoln in the run-up to the Civil War is a great example of this. And so you have another generation who aren't writing stories about the South and the American Revolution because they are now, and going outwards from that, they are going to begin writing histories of the Confederacy and the Civil War. So I think it really can be traced back to that first generation of historians. And so our sense of national identity in the Revolution really is coming from that generation of historians.
That's a really good point. It's as much about the history being written as those writing it. Excellent. Okay. Erin's got a question for you about your research process. Obviously, this is a little bit of a lesser known topic, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to highlight it in the series. How did you find this? Were you researching something else and came across this? Can you tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest and what other things might spark a student or teacher's interest to learn more about their local stories?
So all of this research culminated in a book which came out last fall. And that particular book started in the fall of 2005. So that's how long I have been living with all of this. At the time, I was working on a PhD in early American history, and I was working on a dissertation on a completely and totally different topic, sexual misconduct trials in colonial New England. But I worked in the museum field before I went to grad school, which is where my love of using objects in the classroom comes from. And while I was in grad school, I had wanted to preserve those ties to the museum field. So I interned at the Historical Society in Newport, Rhode Island. And one of the houses in their collection is called the Wanton Lyman Hazard House. And anybody who was in Newport for the Revolutionary Ideals seminar probably has been to that house. And that house belonged to Martin Howard, who I referenced a little while ago. At that time, about all the Newport Historical Society knew about Martin Howard was that he owned that house in the 1750s and 1760s, and he was a loyalist. And they assigned me as my intern project to do more research about him. And I became just completely and totally fascinated by him. And he's another good example of the people taking sides are not necessarily lining up where we think they should be lining up. Martin Howard was a loyalist. He defended the Stamp Act. He quoted the same passage from John Locke, life, liberty, and estate, as part of his defense of the Stamp Act. And when you have a loyalist talking about, we have the right to life, liberty, and estate, by the way, the corollary of that for him was he believed you had the personal right to life, liberty, and estate. You did not necessarily, as a British colonist, have political rights, which means you did not necessarily have the right to vote in parliamentary elections. When you have a loyalist quoting John Locke, you have a world which does not fit the world we're used to. And that was what made me think, okay, I need to know more about this man. And I went back to my university and I finished my dissertation and I wrote a book about sexual misconduct trials in colonial New England. But Martin Howard was always there at the back of my mind. And along the way, I'd done some more research on him. He got kicked out of Newport, Rhode Island. He fled to London. He testified before Parliament, and I'm quoting directly, about the events of the Stamp Act crisis without passion or prejudice, which was a line I really liked and I think says a lot about him. And to thank him for his services to a grateful nation, Parliament recommended to George III that Martin Howard be made the Chief Justice of North Carolina. So he and his family go off to North Carolina in 1767, and they arrive just as the Regulator Rebellion is beginning. So that is what got me to the Regulator Rebellion, a man from Rhode Island. And so I wrote a book about the Stamp Act crisis and the Regulator Rebellion as political rebellions that are happening in the decade before the American Revolution, because we don't tend to think much about the 1760s. And he's the person who's at the heart of this book. And really, writing this book was an effort to better understand his world. But I also became fascinated by Rhode Island and North Carolina as these colonies who don't usually show up in the histories, but who have very, very active political lives in this period. So that's how I got into that.
Absolutely. And this idea that there's so many fascinating stories that can start with somebody being interested in who lived in a house or what did this historical marker say, or, don't discount those local stories, because I think sometimes we think of national stories, but the national stories are made up by bits and pieces of all these smaller stories added together. All right, couple other questions. What I'm going to kind of synthesize here. When we talk about language, and we talk about the way that the regulators are trying to petition for their redress of grievance, is the language and the wording and the style used by those in North Carolina similar to or different from those in New England?
That's a great question. One of the things that fascinated me about the regulator petitions is the portrayal of the regulators as they're a bunch of uneducated hicks in the middle of nowhere who don't know a single thing. But when I started reading their petitions, they're beautifully written. And as part of this research, I was reading up on petitions. I was a legal scholar by training, and so this was also a crash course. And okay, I'm going to be a political scholar now. And so I was reading about petitions, and there's a book by a man named David Zaret in which he makes the argument that petition writing is an art form. You have to follow certain rules. First, you must flatter the person you are petitioning. And oh, the regulators are good at that. Then you politely express your grievances. And then you just throw out your arms and beg. And this is how you write a petition if you are a British subject. And so the regulator petitions are very similar to petitions from New England because they're all coming from the same rule book. That said, one of the rules of writing a petition is you don't make recommendations about what the person could do to fix the situation. Regulator petition number 3 is jam-packed full of recommendations because they've had it. And I found that really interesting. And I don't think that's specific to North Carolina. I think that's doing it the right way didn't work, so let's give this a try. And obviously that didn't work either. But yeah, thinking about the petitions as this is something that follows a certain form is a good way of thinking about the regulators as being part of the larger British Empire. These are people who are all in conversation with each other across the Atlantic Ocean.
You mentioned they're in conversation across the ocean. Are they in conversation up and down the Atlantic seaboard? So is there any talk of, trying to get the Sons of Liberty to come down and support them or back them up? Is there any, kind of correspondence in that direction?
So I'd mentioned Thompson and his Massachusetts spy. And it's very clear that Herman Husband, the pamphlet writer of the regulators, is in correspondence with Thompson. And we don't know where Herman Husband's first pamphlet was published, but it's very clear that his second pamphlet, which is A Fan for Fanning and a Touchstone for Tryon one, was published on Isaiah Thompson's press. So there are those appeals going to Boston. Ezra Stiles is the Congregationalist minister in Newport and a great advocate for revolution and a chronicler of absolutely everything. Stiles is interested in North Carolina because Martin Howard is there, and Stiles is keeping track of Martin Howard. And Stiles talks about the Regulator Rebellion. There's a minister in Boston named John Allen who references the Regulator Rebellion. So as I mentioned earlier, you have all those people outside North Carolina saying, no, imperial overreach, this is bad. But then you have that later pushback of the North Carolina legislature in which they are trying to make it clear that they are good Sons of Liberty, but you're getting the wrong end of the stick here and the regulators are scary. And so I've never had a sense that anybody in another colony had any interest in interfering, but it's very clear that everybody else up and down the Eastern Seaboard knows about this. And also, Tryon corresponds with the other royal governors, and he mentions the regulators periodically, particularly to Thomas Hutchison, who is, of course, also dealing with a lot of difficult colonists in Massachusetts.
Okay. Well, I've got a small question and 2 big questions. If anybody else has got a good question, put it in the queue. There's a couple little ones. We'll look them up and check and get back to you tomorrow. But all right, start with the little question. Does North Carolina still refer to the governor's home as a palace? And if so, why?
That was purely Tryon. So Tryon comes in as the governor in 1765. He is bound and determined to make North Carolina a proper modern colony. And as part of this, he demands his palace. And he borderline bankrupts North Carolina with the building of that particular house. And as you could see from the picture, it's pretty grand. It would play well in Virginia, which is a wealthy colony. The problem is, again, as I mentioned, North Carolina is a very poor colony. So no, that is not a phrase that is still used in North Carolina. That's just that building.
Got it. Okay. When we talk about the pamphlets that are being created and floated around in all the different colonies that are sharing these revolutionary ideas, can you talk a little bit about the literacy rate? When we talk about, how many people could read, what kind of a reading level are we talking about among different groups of people within the colonies? Who really could read this stuff that was being produced at the time?
That's actually something I talk about with my students in class, because I, not surprisingly, have an entire class in the Stamp Act crisis, which, by the way, is what we're going to be doing in class on Thursday of this week, because I wrote a book about the Stamp Act crisis. So we have to spend a whole class on it. And one of the things I start that class with is the literacy rates. It depends on where you are, and it depends on who you are. So New England, white men have a 90% literacy rate. White women have about a 50% literacy rate. Everyone else, and that's kind of a catch-all, is a 20 to 30%. And that's the highest literacy rates in all the colonies. As we come down into the Mid-Atlantic, it's about 80% for white men. It's about 40% for white women. Then you've got that miscellaneous catch-all, about 20%. So you get into the South, there's a distinction between people living along the coast and people living in interior areas. And so for people living along the coast, 90% of white men are literate. Only about 30% of white women are literate. Then the numbers just collapse. The only statistic we have for the southern interior is 30% literacy rate for everyone. The problem with that one is it's not that only 30% of the population is literate. It's that we don't have as many records because they didn't get preserved. So if I had to guess, the literacy rate is higher in the southern backcountry than we think. It's harder to study because there aren't as many records. But to go back to what I do in the classroom, one of the things I talk about is people are responding to the Stamp Act crisis is, okay, you are pro or you are anti the Stamp Act. You have to reach an audience who is literate, but you also have to reach an audience who is illiterate. How do you go about doing that? And so one of the things I have my students do is yes, we read excerpts from the pamphlets, but we spend time with a lot of the Paul Revere engravings. And there's that particularly infamous one of the 5 coffins from the Boston Massacre. And if you look closely at the drawing of the coffins, each of them has a skull and crossbones on it. They also have the initials of the men who were killed in the Boston Massacre. But the thing I say to my students is, okay, pretend you can't read or write. You're looking at a drawing of 5 coffins with skulls and crossbones. Okay, if you couldn't read or write, what is the message you would get from that? And okay, you couldn't figure out the specifics, but you could definitely figure out that something went wrong here. And you could probably figure out that 5 people are dead. And so that's how I tackle that. It is with animals, but also looking at the images that people in the 18th century were using as a way of reaching out to people who are illiterate. And there are a lot of examples that are very useful for that.
Excellent. No, that's a really good point. I don't think we address that so much with our students. Okay, last question is more of a big picture question. A lot of times in classrooms, we talk about communities, whether it be as small as a town or as large as a county or a city. And we talk about them switching, starting off leaning loyalist, ended up leaning patriot, or kind of shifting in either direction. But I don't think we do a good job, and I don't know if we have a real clear answer as to what caused communities to shift one way or another. Can you talk about some of these ideas that might sway a community and have them kind of lean towards one side or the other in this kind of lead up to the revolution or the revolution itself? What changed people's minds?
That's another great question. The lead up to the revolution, there's not a whole lot of moving. I mean, people are coming to their conclusions one way or the other. Then you get into the war itself. And one of the things that makes the American Revolution such an interesting war is the core epicenter of the fighting moves around so much. It, of course, starts in New England, and then it moves down into the mid-Atlantic colonies, now states. 1776, 1777 into 1778. It's very much in the mid-Atlantic, but then in the spring of 1778, the British pull out of Philadelphia. They head into the southern states. And as the war moves around, you have people, individuals, and communities who are responding, because it's one thing to be a patriot or a loyalist if the war is 1,000 miles away. But if you are in a region of the United States, which is occupied by either army, the British Army or the American Army, this is going to have a direct impact on your life. And for example, we know during the British occupation of Philadelphia that there's a rise of the loyalist families. Their daughters are getting invited to all the parties, and this is great for them. But then the British pull out in 1778, and a lot of those families are left reeling. And you have a reassertion of patriots as the mid-Atlantic comes back into American hands. And so, yes, people are making decisions for political reasons. And I think this next point helps to humanize people during the revolution. They're also making decisions for practical reasons. If you are in a region which is being occupied by one side or the other, if you are on the other side, you are going to be keeping your head down, because at the end of the day, you also need your family to survive. And finally, going back into North Carolina, one of the things we know about the revolution in the South was this was the angriest, most violent part of the war. And I think some of that was just sheer PTSD. I mean, this war goes on and on and on. But I think some of it is also that those pre-existing tensions, regulators are becoming loyalists. The people who oppose the Regulator rebellion are by and large becoming patriots. That anger is going to explode during the revolution because there's fuel for it. So yes, it's one part you're making political decisions because this is what you believe, but there's also the practicalities of how do you survive an occupation if you're on the wrong side.
Absolutely. And I really do appreciate the way that you kind of upend our idea of patriots and loyalists and kind of challenge things. And I think encourage us to look at this era in communities, in local communities, and look at different stories. It's not all, John and Sam and the Sons of Liberty up in Boston. They're part of the story. But if we say that's the story, man, we've missed out on a whole lot of that story. All right, let me pass things off to Krista to wrap us for this evening.
Great. Thank you again to Dr. Chandler for everything that you shared tonight and really your extensive time spent answering questions in such a meaningful way. And thank you, Lynn, for moderating the Q&A. So if you have not yet, please scan the QR code or follow the link to complete your survey. That counts for your attendance. And if I can get this slide, oh, there we go. Our thanks to the Dr. Scholl Foundation for their generous support of Rev Ideals. You'll see new materials drop Friday, and if there's any questions at all that you have, just send me an email and let me know what I can do to support you. And thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in March, right? Yes, March.
Have a good night, everybody. Thanks.
Take care.